Welcome to the Teach Joyfully podcast, where we talk about all things elementary teaching with some mom stuff thrown in. I'm Lisa Burns, a teacher success coach, veteran elementary teacher, and mom of 5. I'll be your host. Thanks for joining me today. I have today a special guest. She's been here once before, Lauren Ranalli, and she is a children's author, but she also helps people with self-publishing. So if you've got a book in you, this is the episode for you. Lauren is not only an award-winning children's book author, but she is, in fact, a marketing coach for aspiring and self-published authors. She lives in Michigan with her husband, children, and a high-energy puppy. I'm sure a lot of you have puppies these days, too. There's been a puppy craze with COVID, for sure. She has graciously agreed to chat with me today about getting that book that's in your head from thought to published. And if you remember, we did speak with Lauren a while back about her writing, but today we're talking about her mission to help others publish their books as well, because there is room for us all. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks so much for having me back.
I'm just so excited to talk to you again. I enjoyed our last conversation so much. And this is such a great way to help other people. And teachers of all people have books in them. So many teachers have books rolling around in their heads, just dying to be published. But sometimes we don't know what to do or where to begin, and it seems overwhelming. And so we just keep putting them off, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. I did that for the first, I want to say 8 years of having a book in my head. I had no idea what to do. And I assumed that you had to have a publisher and an agent, and you had to find all those things and go through that whole process. And I didn't even know about the world of self-publishing or hybrid publishing or indie publishing when I started. I didn't know that was a thing you could do. And I think so many people are in the same position.
And I think more people probably know about it. I'm sure there's plenty of people who don't, but I think now these days, more people probably know about it. But I think there's still this perception that you cannot be a successful author and make money at it as a self-published author, that maybe it's just a way to crack open the door and then you still have to go the other route. And that is not necessarily true anymore, is it?
It's really not. First and foremost, I think that when people have a book that they want to put out there, I do think that there is value in sort of identifying for yourself, what are your goals, right? And your goals can change over time, certainly. I know my own have, but is your goal to put a book out there that people will read and enjoy and love? Or is your goal to put a book out there that people will read and enjoy and love and have it in every single Barnes and Noble across the country and do a national book tour and be on the road and do it? There's these varying degrees of what it means to be an author and to put your work out into the world. And for so many of us, and particularly the authors that I work with and I do coaching with, they're not trying to make this their full life's work, right? They're a teacher, they're a parent. I mean, in my case, I'm a public health professional. They're working in other fields. I work with a lot of therapists who want to write books for kids or for adults. And so it's not always that people are saying, I want to leave my current job or my current profession and be a full-time author. It's that I have this story that I want out in the world, and I want people to know about it and read it and enjoy it while I'm maintaining the rest of my life. And so I think those are two very different things. But I think that people need to have some expectations around their goals, their time, and capacity when really thinking about what does it mean to put a book out in the world.
I think that is great advice for sure. All right, so let's back up just a little bit, because you're a busy mom, you have a career as well, and you don't have to give up those things in order to be an author. So how do you fit this into a busy life is always kind of the fear, right? So we put this book in our heads and we feel like we don't have the right credentials or we're too busy. So where do you go from there?
Yeah, so much of it is all about how we manage and prioritize our time, because we all have the same 24 hours in the day. And there's so many competing demands. And it's not realistic to say, okay, well, at least for me, I will only speak for myself. It was not realistic for me to say, I'm going to carve out 6 hours a day to dedicate to this project or this side passion. And I'm going to do it in 2 months and get it out there, right? I had to think about longer term. And there's different phases to the production process and how much time and energy it takes. And if I'm in the midst of writing a book, that's less time actually than if I'm in the stage of launching a book. And so the writing process or the collaborating with an illustrator, that was done over several months. And I could fit that in. I could say, okay, I'm dedicating Saturday mornings to writing. And every Thursday evening, I'd have a check-in with the illustrator, or every other week we'd do a check-in. So I could schedule that out and commit to those times, and also let the other members of my family know these are the times when I'm doing this. This is a commitment, just as if I had a work meeting for my other profession, or if we had a parent-teacher meeting, or I put it in the calendar, I put it on the schedule to know that it's really going to happen. But then the busy times of year for me are truly when I'm either launching a new book or it's holiday season or whatever it is. There's sort of these annual or cyclical times of year where I just know things are busier and I have to make ways to account for that. And I'm not saying that it's easy, and I'm not saying that I've done it extremely well all of the time. I think the point I'm trying to make is, at least for me, the process of writing and publishing and sustaining a book is not the same amount of time each day or each week of the year. It's really sort of these different phases that you go through.
Sure. But you also have to have a regular writing time in order to be, because you haven't just put out one book, you're writing your fourth book now. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So one book, and you thought it was just going to be one book, and then it turned into, well, maybe there's another, and then maybe there's another. And that can happen, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's one book. But sustaining a writing life, and we talk about this as teachers, that we need to be writers ourselves, even if it's just journaling or whatever it is. In order to teach writing well, we have to be writers, because there's a struggle to writing. But sustaining a writing life in the midst of all of the craziness and busyness, that's something that we need to be able to figure that piece out. And so what is your regular writing schedule, knowing you're a busy mom and have a career?
Yes. I'm just holding this for you to see. I know people listening can't see it, but I have this little standing calendar on my desk that's just a handwritten note that sort of breaks out my tasks. I'll say writing and author tasks for the week and which days I'm doing it. And I basically allow myself, depending on the day, sort of 60 to 90 minutes a day in the mornings, most mornings when I can. I get up early before other people in the house are up, and I take the dog for a walk, and I do some good thinking, or I listen to writing or marketing podcasts during that time. And that gets me in a good headspace. And then I come and I sit down up here in my office and I write. And sometimes I'm writing journal prompts or story starters or prompts to get me thinking creatively about a book project, or I'm doing editing on a current project. But a lot of my writing right now is actually about maintaining communication with my readers and with the author audience that I've built. And so I actually think of writing as a much bigger piece of the author role than just writing the actual book. So I write newsletters, I write blog posts, I write social media posts. And so I keep that sort of creative process going, but as a way of sort of always tying back into either books that I have published, books that I'm going to publish, or additional resources that I have for aspiring and self-published and indie published authors. So for me, my writing schedule and practice is all about first waking up and ideally getting outside. I do live in the Midwest, so it's not always the most pleasant, depending on the time of the year. Early morning can be a little chilly, but I get outside, I listen to something creative or inspiring, and then I sit down and I write. But for a lot of people, that morning routine does not work for them. And I also know I am a morning person. I am not a night owl. If I try to do my creative work after 9 p.m. even, there's no way. After I've put the kids to bed and I'm just done. I don't want, that is not my time and space. So I think also just knowing yourself and your own sort of natural rhythms is really important.
Can you tell me, so you have a family, you have kids, things come up. And so you have this commitment that is early morning for you. I mean, someone could commit to Sunday afternoons, or it could be one day a week. It could be anything, but it's just a commitment. And do you ever find that you get there and so you literally have no words? I mean, you're just like, I have no words, but you still show up and do something?
It's so true. Sometimes I sit there and I'm like, what am I going to think about and write about today. And it's true. Sometimes you're just not in that space, but I make sure to kind of commit that time. And sometimes for me, at least, it is just a matter of putting pencil to paper. I do my best thinking, actually physically writing, I don't start typing. And so sometimes I will just write out related tasks that I want to do the next week, or I'll write out a thought I had, or I'll look for a journal prompt or a quote prompt or something like that. Because sometimes it's just a matter of actually starting rather than staring. And so I think that it's hard. And I also think cut yourself some slack. Sometimes there are just days or weeks when everything else in life is so overwhelming, or things in the world are so overwhelming. And so sometimes I'll write about that. It's not like a formal journal or anything, but I'll just write down, especially it's been interesting during this time of the COVID pandemic. And my kids are relatively young. They're 9 and 7 right now. But when this all started, they were 5.5 and 7.5. And especially when I think about the early days of the pandemic, I think about like, what will we sort of forget about, or will they not remember that I would want them to know about that time? And so I just write down a couple of memories I have of trying to grocery shop, or the first weeks that school shut down. And I'll just write down little notes to myself of things to tell them about. So I'm just doing the act of writing, even if it's not going to translate into a book idea or a blog post or a newsletter.
Right. And we tell that to students to do that as well in their writing journals. That's something that an ideas list is always something that's just this ongoing list. And we all need to keep it because we can refer back to it when we can't think of anything else. And sometimes, oh, yeah, I really liked that idea. Maybe I can work on that. And so that's really important. But it's also about keeping that commitment to yourself and showing up for yourself during that writing time, because it's like when you kind of have a streak going and it's like you break the streak and it's really hard to get back on, right? It's just like a diet. As soon as you quit and I'm just going to take a break, but then going back to it, nearly impossible. Workout routine,
so hard.
Right? So hard to restart. Starting is one thing, restarting is so much harder. And so we know that it's actually attached to brain research. We know that restarting is harder than just starting in the first place. That's why people change their workout when they've quit for a while. They do something completely different because it's easier to start something new than it is to go back to an old routine. There's just something in our brain that makes it really hard. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it is really difficult.
It's very hard. And the research, I think this may be incorrect, but I think it takes 30 days to create a habit, I want to say, is what I've heard. There's a set number of times you have to do something before it becomes a habit. And again, giving yourself that flexibility. Like I said, my plan is to do this every morning. And some mornings I will be on a podcast interview during my writing time, or sometimes we've got an early meeting or whatever it is. And so knowing that it's okay if you have to give yourself some grace and flexibility, but that doesn't mean to get off or out of the habit.
Right. Exactly. Even if you show up at your regular time for 5 minutes, knowing that your day's gone to hell in a handbasket and you're going to have to go take off and do something else because something's come up, that's okay, but you showed up. And having showed up, even for those couple of minutes, can make all the difference in the world of really just keeping that habit. And that's just habits. I talk about habits a lot. And it does take a while to create a habit. And that number of days is different for different people. And so there's kind of this range. And everyone is a little different. And some habits are easier to create than others. It just, we don't necessarily always understand why. But yeah, it's keeping the habit for sure. Okay, so during your writing time, you might be writing, you might be editing, you might be revising, you might be working on promotion of a book, you might be interacting on your website with your readers and a blog with your readers or on social media. And all of those are pieces of being an author. And so there's lots of things you do during that writing time, not necessarily just write your book. And so having those pieces in place and knowing that all of them need to happen, maybe having a schedule does help. Do you have someone ever help you with the revising and editing? How do you manage that? Because it's
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important. So for children's book writers, I think that you do not want to skip the step of working with an editor. I mean, I would say that for authors of all genres, but also I'll start with editors. And I will say that there's various types of editors too, right? There's a developmental editor who's going to help you with like story arc and character development if that's something you need. There are kind of line item editors. There are editors who, if your book rhymes, will help you with the cadence and the pacing. And you may not need every single type of editor, but I think it's important to identify or talk to a couple editors to say, here's where I am in the process. What do you think I need? Because it's more than just proofreading, right? It's not just proofreading, although that's incredibly important. And trust me, you will look at your work 50 times and not see a mistake, and somebody else will find it. So editing is incredibly valuable and important. But also, as a children's book author, I just want to say to people out there, if you are not an illustrator, don't illustrate your own book. So many people say, well, I like to draw, and I think they often use it as a way to sort of cut costs for the book process. But I always tell the authors that I'm working with, do what I call the Barnes and Noble test, which is picture your book either in your mind or literally take your book to Barnes and Noble and hold it up against other books or local bookstores, wherever it is. Do this test of what does your book look like? Or what do your draft illustrations look like next to the books on the shelf? Because whether you believe it or not, you are a professional writer. Whether it's your main job or not, this is something that you are doing professionally. And I think we all can agree, parents, teachers, whoever's, that a poorly illustrated book can really just impact a child's willingness to grab it off the shelf. There's a few things that I personally think will sink a book. And I think one can be illustrations. And I mentioned having an editor for rhymes. I also think that a rhyming book that doesn't land, that doesn't hit the right marks, as a parent, and I'm sure as a teacher, is so hard to read out loud and can just make it a really fumbling experience for the readers and the listeners. So I always tell people, I know that as a self-published author, you are trying not to put out too many personal expenses up front, but editing and illustrating are investments that will make valuable returns to you time and time again.
I agree with that 100%. And as an educator in the elementary space, I think that illustrations and rhyming are such key pieces. If you do a rhyming book, how many times have you tried as a teacher to, how many times as an educator in that elementary space, I believe that illustrations are so incredibly important. They speak to us and it sets the tone for the story. And so many times there's a great story and the illustrations are kind of okay. And quite often what happens is either we don't choose the book or the kids don't pick it back up again because it doesn't work together. It doesn't speak to them. But that book that has amazing illustrations and a decent story is going to fly off the shelves, but also fly into the hearts of everyone who reads it. And that's really important. The same is true for rhyming. How often as a parent or a teacher have we read a book where the rhyme scheme is just not quite right? I mean, it's rhymes, but the cadence is wrong, or it's just like, and it drives you nuts. Well, it's not going to fly with kids either. It's not going to speak to their hearts, and it's just not going to be anything they're going to learn anything from because they can't get over the fact that it's awkward. And you might use it as a lesson for what not to do, but you're certainly not going to use it as what to do.
Right. And in that moment, not the lesson you want to be sharing. And so my fourth book that's coming out this year is called Snow Day at the Zoo. And it is a rhyming book. And it's the first one I've done. And before it went to the editing phase, I had several people I know, I just sort of handed them the manuscript and had them read it out loud to me. And I was like, oh, they are hitting words differently than I was in my head. I was doing it over and over again in my own head, and they were doing it differently. And what was interesting is a couple of times I was like, okay, everyone is reading it differently from me, but in the same way. And there were a couple of times where I was like, oh, everyone is just reading that differently. No matter who reads it, it's sort of a different reading. And so I had to work with an editor on that to make sure that I wasn't losing the messaging. But sometimes it's as simple and as hard as changing a syllable or adding or removing a word in that sentence. And I say it's simple, but as many people know, as an author who's trying to rhyme, adding or removing a word can actually be a little tricky, but it's so important. And it made the book so much easier for people to read.
Yeah, for sure. And I like the idea that you had other people read it out loud too, so you can hear it, because it's so different to hear it in someone else's voice than it is in our own voice, because we hear it in our heads and how we mean it. And that's great. But when other people are reading it, it is different, and it does take on a different life. And that's pretty powerful to be able to hear that. I think that could work very well from even not with rhyming books, with other books too.
Yeah.
Okay. So now let's get down to what people really want to know. We have our editor. You've got someone to do your illustrations. Now, where are you finding these people?
So the illustrator, I lucked out and had like a informal connection to somebody local. But what I tell people a lot of the time is if there's a great place to start would be your local chapter of the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. So if anyone out there is thinking of writing a book and you haven't joined SCBWI, Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, go on their website and join. I think an annual membership is something like $90. It's not outrageously expensive, and it's incredibly worth it. They have resources and conferences and all these things, but there's local and regional chapters for every state or area. And that is a great place to start, because you can get on their listserv, you can email the entire chapter and say, hey, I'm looking for an illustrator in this particular style, or I want digital versus hand-drawn illustrations. And so you are already tapped into a network of people who have published books, who have either done traditional or hybrid or self-publishing. Because another place that people oftentimes go, which I think is an okay thing to do, is they'll go to Facebook groups for writers and illustrators and say, hey, I'm looking for an illustrator. And while that's fine, I've also seen people just get inundated with proposals from illustrators who maybe aren't actually illustrators. They're just sort of graphic artists who are trying to get all these side gigs and whatnot. And so I know some people who had success there, but I recommend going with people who have already published a book. So that's where I would go for illustrators. For editors, there's a couple of different places. If you go with a hybrid kind of publishing place that will help you do some elements of the book, they'll have in-house editors. Reedsy, Reedsy, is a place that you can go to get bids from different editors on projects. And I've used a Reedsy editor before. I hope she doesn't mind that I'm about to do this, but I personally have worked with Heidi Fiedler, who has edited, I think, 3 of my books right now. And I just really adore her and her work. And you can look her up on Instagram and just get a true sense of her personality and her services and her styles. But she's somebody that I have recommended a number of times.
Very good. Awesome. So moving into the next phase, then self-publishing. So now you've got all this done, your book is ready to go. How do you self-publish?
Yes. So there's some pieces that you have to figure out, right? I think the first thing that I recommend to people, I'm trying to think of the order that I would recommend this, but I think once you have a book that is edited and illustrated, there's a few things that you need to do. You need to determine where you're selling the book. And I'll go into that. You also need to start finding your audience. And I recommend that people do this much earlier than they think they need to. And then you need to figure out as well who's actually printing the book and how it's being distributed. So, and those two, I guess, are kind of linked with the how you're going to distribute. So I'll just give my own personal example. So I sell most of my books, probably 95% of my books, through my own website. And the other 5% are a combination of Amazon and author events. Having your own website as an author, I think, is incredibly important, regardless of if you are personally taking sales or you're just redirecting people to an Amazon page to purchase. I think it's an incredibly valuable space for you to showcase who you are, your personality. If you've got any free downloads like coloring pages or word searches or reading guides, go along with your book. But it's also imperative to have if you want to do your own distribution, which I do, and I know is not possible for everyone. But what that means is that when somebody places an order on my site, I am going to the post office and sending that book to them. And what I like about that, there are 3 things I like about doing this. One, I can kind of personalize each order, right? I can sign the book. I can put a little insert in. My book, Let's Meet on the Moon, is all about letter writing and pen pals. And so it comes with postcards that friends and readers can send each other. So I can put those into the book with it. So that's the first thing I like about selling through my website is I can personalize the packages. The second thing I like is that I make more money that way. Amazon will take a cut of your sales, or when you're in a bookstore, they take a cut of your sales. When somebody buys through my website, nobody's taking a cut of the sales. It just costs me what it costs to print the book and what it costs to ship the book, although I charge for shipping, so that's covered. So you make more money selling through your own site. But the third thing, and I think the most important thing about selling through your own website, is that I get my customers' email addresses. So I can message them after the fact to say, thank you so much. I'd love it if you could leave a review here. I can put them on into an email list where they'll start getting my newsletter, and I can tell them about upcoming books or sales or events, or when I'm on a podcast that they may want to listen to. So I can communicate with people, and your email list is so valuable to you as an author. But all of that is if you are going to do your own distribution, which is not easy for everybody. And you have to have space somewhere to store your books, and you have to have the ability to get yourself to the post office. And I just know that during a book launch and during the holidays, I'm going to the post office at least twice a week to do like bundled shipments. I just know that. I factor it in the same way I factor in like my writing time. I factor in post office time. So that's a thing to consider. But the other thing to consider would be, if you're going to just sell through Amazon, for example, then you probably want to look at a KDP or an Ingram Spark as your printer, because they do what's called print on demand, which means that you don't have to have a big stack of books printed to ship out. It means when an order comes in, they print it and ship it. And that's great. It's easy. You don't have to interact with that process at all. But it does mean that you don't interact with that process at all. You don't sign your books. You don't make as much money, and you don't have any contact information for the people who purchase from you. So you have no way of maintaining a relationship with them. But from an author effort perspective, it's a lot less effort. So again, making decisions about your capacity and like what's realistic for you.
Exactly. And one way isn't necessarily right or wrong. What's right for you and figuring that out. And if selling on Amazon is the best way for you, by all means, go right ahead. I mean, then you also can do an ebook format. You can do a lot of things. And so it's fine. It's not about you have to do this, or you have to do that. You can still have an author page. You can reference it in the book and have, direct people there. That way you can reference it in your bio on Amazon. There's lots of ways to still do that. And people do. And they work with big communities. You can do a Facebook community for your readers. There's lots of things that you can do. So it doesn't mean that completely cuts you out of the process, but it may cut down some of it just because you're not getting all of those leads from having people buy directly from you, which is the decision. But if you don't have a lot of time, that can be a really realistic decision. And then you can still do what you want to do as an author.
Absolutely. I completely agree. There's no right or wrong. It's not a judgment to do it one way or the other. You can also start one way and change your mind and do it a different way. You could, maybe for your initial launch, you want to sell directly so that you can put in some initial pre-sale giveaways or whatever it is. And then after you do that launch, maybe you want to transition to just selling online through Amazon or vice versa. You can also do both. Like I said, I have my books on Amazon and I have them through my website, but where I direct my audience of readers is to my website. But I have them on Amazon so people can find them organically. It's a nice place to get reviews. So I think there's definite benefits to both.
Okay, very good. Very good. All right. So as you're thinking about, you were going to start out today, what steps would you take to get started?
So outside of the illustration and editing process, and I would make a decision about, or at least an initial decision about how I'm going to sell the book, because that impacts how much you're going to charge for it, how much it's going to cost to print, and sort of make that decision on who is printing your book and how it's getting distributed. And then the next thing I would really start focusing on is, who is your audience of readers? And I think that so many people think about marketing their book when their book comes out, or a month or two before their book comes out. They're like, okay, I'm going to start telling people about it. And I recommend that if you have a book idea in mind, or you are actively writing a manuscript, start talking about your book and start telling people. And I have actually a free training on my website that's called Social Media for Authors. I think it's actually called Finding Social Media Success. And it walks you through some of just the very practical steps of building an author online presence. Because I think that one of the things I did well that I sort of tapped into with my first book is I started talking about this book a solid 8 to 10 months before I ever had a proof of it in my hand. But I started an author social media page. I started with Instagram, which is my personal favorite platform, but I also have Facebook and Twitter. But I started with Instagram and I just started building the audience. And I walk you through in this free training and some other trainings and resources I have how to really do that and do that well. And when I launched my first book, I had an audience of readers who I connected with on social media, but I also just emailed every person I knew. I mean, like really everyone I knew. I told them ahead of time, hey, I'm doing this and this book is coming out. And then when the book was ready to come out, in my first 3 months of publishing my very first self-published book, I did $10,000 in sales. And that really surprised me. But first I was thinking, oh, my parents and my neighbor and my college roommate will buy this book and hopefully some other people. But when I really started seeing these sales coming in, and I set up, I think, 30 promotional events in the first 6 months, and I had done all this legwork to have an audience of people waiting to read the book. That was one of the smartest things that I did. And in this training and some of the coaching and training things that I do, I work with authors because I think one of the natural questions is, well, if my book isn't ready, what the hell am I talking about to them? What am I saying for 6 to 8 months ahead of time? And so I walk people through a strategy and a platform to say, okay, here are the different things you can and should be talking about to your audience. Here are the different ways that you can use the social media platforms to find like-minded folks who are interested in your book, because I think it's definitely something we all need to do. And I think most of us do it later in the game than we should. I'm not going to say do it too late. Like there's no such thing as too late. If you have a book that's published and you haven't done this yet, okay, start today. Today is fine. There's no such thing as it's too late to do this, but doing it early on in the process is going to benefit you.
Yeah. I agree. And I think it can make such a difference because, I mean, you could talk about anything, even just struggling with the writing today or whatever it is. I mean, you can talk about your process. You don't talk about the details of your book per se. You can give hints about it, but it's kind of building this momentum of this is coming and, oh, you're going to love it. It's about this kind of little bit and you're not giving away too much. You're just giving away little bits. I know a woman on Instagram that I followed for a long time. She was an illustrator and she would put up her illustrations and stuff. And then they started to evolve into a book. And so she started giving little hints about, oh, here's my first few characters for this book. And she had drawn these pictures and I can't wait to share that with you. And it was this process. And I was like a rabid dog by the time her book came out, because I mean, it was so awesome just to see little pieces. So you could talk about, here's one illustration that we're thinking about. What do you think? All of those things. There's lots of ways to talk about it without actually giving away all of the details.
Exactly. So I have sort of a signature system that I've kind of developed and honed about 5 opportunities for content that connects. That sort of how do you rotate through these different content ideas. And exactly, so much of it is about behind the scenes. I know that one of the things about social media is that for better or worse, it gives us access into people's lives. And so you almost expect that at this point, right? So if I'm following a page that is only, here's my book cover, here it is on a shelf, here's me to like about my book is on sale. I'm not interested in that. Whether it's an author or a chef or a musician or anybody that I follow, there's a musician I like and they're only posting their album covers. That is not interesting to me. I want to see them in their studio. I want to see them on tour. I want to see them writing a song. I want to see them living their life. That's what we've come to expect from people. And so one of the other things I do in my coaching sessions with folks is how do you do that kind of balance between your personal and your professional? And how do you market your book if you are an introvert, right? I am actually a very introverted person. I do a lot of media and platforms and I'm online a lot. But it's not always the easiest for me. And it's not the thing that comes most naturally. And so I do a lot of coaching sessions with people about how to find a balance and how to find a balance that feels true and authentic to you and that you don't have to have the same sort of attitude and energy a social media influencer does or whatever it is. So helping people find the right feel and space for them.
Right. Exactly. Social media is not natural for me either. And it's one of those things I have to work at it a little bit and put myself out there a little more than is natural for me, but you do it because it's part of what you do. It's part of your business, and it's part of what people that you're connecting with, want to hear and that they need to know in order to be able to connect with you and understand what you're offering to them. So it's just part of life. It's not going away. And so we need to learn how to manage that and do it in a way that's authentic and real and honest.
Absolutely. I completely agree.
Okay. So what kind of help do you offer to authors?
So I have a number of things. I have a free newsletter. You can sign up on my website at laurenranalli.com, and I send out weekly resources and tips. And I think that's one of the best ways to connect with me. As I mentioned, I have this free social media training on my website. And then I also have some other trainings that I have developed to be really impactful and actionable, and also I think reasonably priced. I charge $39 for a training because I know that author budgets are limited and small. But one of the ones that I recommend to people as a starting point is called the Self-Publishing Roadmap. And so when you were asking me, like, what people need to do, what do they need to know? This is a training that sort of walks you through those steps of what do you need to know and what decisions do you need to make. I also offer a training on another one called Social Media for Authors, and then also one on creating your author brand. And how do you start really thinking about yourself as a professional writer and establishing that online presence. And then I do coaching calls, coaching sessions, one-on-one individual sessions with folks who are like, okay, I'm really at the beginning of this process and I just want some help thinking through a strategy. Or I'll do coaching sessions with people who are getting ready to do a book launch and they're trying to develop their launch team and their launch strategy. Or a lot of times I do coaching sessions with people who say, okay, I went through my initial book launch and it went really well. And now sales are tapering. And what do I do to sustain them? Because that's a real thing as well. That happens with every author I've known. It's happened with me as well, with every book. You get this initial push and then it's kind of like, oh, okay, a few months later, and now what? And now how do I sustain this? So free newsletter, a free training, and then a couple of paid options and coaching sessions are all up on my website. And I just worked with authors, I think, in 32 countries by this point, and it's so much fun. I just love it.
Awesome. That's awesome. I love it. And I love that you're doing this because it's so nice to have someone who can walk you through the process when it is overwhelming. There is so much to know and so much unknowns in there. And it's like this big mystery. And a lot of authors kind of want to keep the whole thing to themselves, like it's a competition. And they don't want to disclose some of those things because they feel like, well, then there's more competition out there. But it's not competition. There's room for everyone's book out there. There's a different audience and sometimes the same audience for all of these different pieces. I mean, how often as teachers do we buy 10 different books on back to school, right? Because we read them more than one day, right? And there's different perspectives and different pieces, and they approach it from a different angle. And so all of those books are still valuable, even though they're all really about the same topic.
I completely agree. And I've talked about this a lot, where I actually feel like the children's book space can and should be one of the least competitive spaces out there, because there's no reason why me helping an author put their book out there means somebody isn't going to buy my book. It's just not true. We buy books in mass, and there's no reason why we can't all enjoy more than one book. And truthfully, the reason why I put out this weekly newsletter with these kind of tips and recommendations is it really does kind of pain me to think about every person, every author I've worked with, or aspiring author, or somebody who has a book idea, going through these exact same steps, right? Everybody has the same questions. Everybody wants to know, how do I buy an ISBN barcode for my book? Everybody wants to know, what is the difference between KDP online distribution versus doing my own? Like, we all have the same questions, and there's no reason why we all have to do the exact same research to get the same answer. There's only kind of one or two answers to how do I get an ISBN barcode for my book, right? We don't all need to spend time researching that. I have a blog post on it. Go to my website and check it out. And it really does feel painful to me that people have to spend so much of their really limited time and capacity going through the exact same steps that I did. So I am more than happy to put some of those resources and strategies and very specific nuggets of wisdom on a blog post or in my newsletter to save you some time so that you can really focus on what makes your book unique and how to find your specific audience. Because I want to read your book. I want to know what you're up to.
Well, and that's just it. I think that pretty much sums everything up, is that there's room for everyone in this pond. There really is. And as teachers, we do recreate the wheel a lot. Yeah. And it's so much nicer when we can share those resources. And this is just another way for us to share resources and knowledge, and in a way that makes sense, so that we can all access it and move forward and put out and be the people that we're called to be. So yes. I think that's fabulous. So quick recap, know who your audience is, obviously, and then get that schedule and your outline and all that stuff down. But then we have to have set writing time, whatever that is for you. If it's once a week, if it's every day for 5 minutes, whatever that is, that you're going to squeeze that time in and commit to, but it is a commitment and a habit. You're going to build that habit by showing up for yourself. And then from there, having readers and reviewers, getting an editor, getting an illustrator, having people help you, and not trying to do all of those pieces yourself when those aren't your strengths. And
absolutely.
You can't do it all yourself when you get to that point. You really do need to have other voices and other eyes on the manuscript as well. And then obviously that whole publishing process is answering all those questions. And run to Lauren's website, go take advantage of her free stuff. She has tons of great free stuff. You don't ever have to pay for a thing. You really can find so much of what you're looking for free. And then if you want to invest a little bit, great. But if not, no worries. There's plenty of ways to look some of that stuff up as well, but at least it gets you on the right track. And I think you have some freebies that we talked about. And so I will post those in the show notes. And then I think you have a brand new self-publishing roadmap as well. And I think we have a link to that as well. Is that correct?
I believe so. And we'll make sure it happens. So that's fantastic.
Awesome. And how can they get hold of you?
So I think my website is certainly one of the best places, laurenranalli.com, and just go ahead and sign up for the free newsletter. And then Instagram is really where I'm most active. And that's lauren.ranalli_author. That's where I sort of have the most fun with my online presence.
Awesome. And her name is Lauren, Lauren, and Ranalli is Ranalli, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So don't worry, my teacher friends, all the links to everything is in the show notes. So you can run to the show notes, grab it all. And I can't wait to see what you are going to write. And when you do, make sure that you contact both me and Lauren, because we want to read your book.
Yes, we do.
All right. Thanks, Lauren, so much for being here today.
Thank you, Lisa. It was great to talk to you again.
All right, my teacher friends, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Lauren as much as I did. In the show notes, I will also make some notes about how you can apply some of Lauren's process to teaching children to write as well. So that's it for this episode, my teacher friends. We're out of time and I'm out of breath. Thanks so much for joining me today. If you liked today's episode, I'd love it if you'd go to Apple Podcast or wherever you listen and leave a review. And while you're there, hit the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. Also, you can find the show notes and all the resources mentioned in this episode on my website at www.hopeineducation.com/podcast. And remember, a happy teacher is a good teacher. Until next time, teach joyfully and take care of you.